Good evening, I'm Jim Zirin. This is the digital age. With us tonight is Amity Shlaes, author, blogger, columnist. Amity Shlaes is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She has also written a compelling book entitled The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, about the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. In the book, she argues that Roosevelt's New Deal policies lengthened rather than shortened the Depression, sort of counterintuitive. Now she's working on a book about the Roaring '20s, laissez-faire economics, the era of Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was perhaps the forgotten president. But here tonight to tell us why he may not be forgotten so quickly is Amity Shlaes. Amity, welcome to the digital age.
Oh, thank you.
Now, let's start with the forgotten man. That phrase came from a speech Roosevelt made in 1932 where he referred to the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. You knew that. Now, that was the person he was trying to help. Certainly historians think he was trying to help them, but your book gives it a different twist. Please tell us.
Roosevelt spoke of the forgotten man at the bottom of the pyramid. We know that phrase. Yes, Jim. But he liberated the phrase from another man, a philosopher named William Graham Sumner. And Sumner had this little algebra of the forgotten man. He said A wants to help X, the man down there, the poor man, the homeless man, and B does too. Nothing wrong with that. That's charity. Comes the problem when A and B get together and pass a law that coerces C into co-funding their perhaps good but perhaps dubious project for X. C, Sumner said, is the forgotten man, the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who is not thought of. And that raises the question for us in modern times when there's a new law, whether it regards tax or mandates or who is swept along with it, forced to pay for it, even when it may not be a good idea, this law.
So your forgotten man is the guy who picks up the check.
Picks up the check. And in the 1930s, they knew this very well. Sumner died before Roosevelt was president, but he was he was a legendary professor at Yale, and everyone knew about Sumner's forgotten man. So it was kind of a duel of the forgotten men, and they debated this. Is it the homeless man at the bottom, or is it the taxpayer who subsidizes the project for the homeless man? Who is needier here?
Well, there are a number of issues that Roosevelt confronted which kind of resonate today. Number one, he raised taxes during the Depression. I guess Herbert Hoover did too. We recently ran around this issue with President Obama, and the final compromise was, of course, that tax cuts would be continued. But do you see the issues, the economic issues that were involved with the Great Depression as resonating today?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the tax issue was quite important because they had a low rate. Their Bush rate was much more impressive. It was 25%. And in fact, they cut taxes a tiny bit when the crash of '29 hit down to 24, but just momentarily. And then they moved up with Hoover and then with Roosevelt into the 60s and higher. That would be the top marginal rate on the income tax. So that changed the culture. In addition, they had other taxes which were counterproductive for business, such as the so-called undistributed profits tax. The idea was to get business going, to get it to spend. And when it wasn't spending, well, the government was cross with it. So they created this tax to squeeze the money out of companies in the mid-30s, undistributed profit tax, things like that.
Well, that was eventually repealed, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, and that was part of the rebellion against Roosevelt. But you have this period, 35 to 40, where, and this is the second factor that's common with today, there was a lot of uncertainty about what the government would do. Where is the limit? Who will draw the line as to how far they will go? And Roosevelt had this enormous landslide, historic, in 1936, taking 46 out of 48 states. There was no limit to what he could do. Can you imagine the inaugural address that he gave was, "We seek in government," I paraphrase some of this, "an instrument of unimagined power to fashion a higher order of things." So what he said is basically we can do what we like with government. And even though some of what he wanted to do was good, for example, he began to free trade up with a trade law with Cordell Hull. The very uncertainty, and this is what concerns us today, was frightening to markets. And you can see that in the volatility. Statistically, it was an extremely volatile decade. It's more remarkable even for its volatility than for its stock market drops.
Well, that brings us to Roosevelt's relationship with big business. Populist presidents like to take on big business. Roosevelt did. Kennedy called them SOBs and sent the stock market into a tailspin. He said, I know, my father told me what SOBs all these guys are. Obama tried to take on big business. Now he's seeking a rapprochement at a state dinner with Hu Jintao, invited the head of Goldman Sachs and other CEOs. What do you make of that issue in terms of the past and the present?
Well, with the president, you always want to ask, what is their reality? What's important to them? What have they experienced? Roosevelt was an attorney, but basically he was a political animal. He was a master of politics, so he thought of the world in terms of constituencies. Who do I reach out to? Who do I get? Farmers? Wall Street? Which constituency is expendable today, and which is the constituency I need to reward very much at this point to continue my political process? So business wasn't very real to Roosevelt except as a constituency. He didn't think he needed them. He kind of enjoyed irritating them because he came from a wealthy background, and it was sort of that dissing the parental culture. I think that we put that in modern terms. It gave him a little bit of pleasure. He liked mischief, to mock what he grew up with. He did that with Harvard University. He liked to mock where he'd come from, a little bit of an edge, kind of fun, and he didn't care. So he was back and forth. Once in a while, he would have what they called a breathing spell, very similar to President Obama recently. Let's make nice, let's be friends, let's signal.
Another Harvard attorney.
Yeah, another Harvard attorney, let's signal. And then the mood would switch, and he would say, you've met your master. That was the phrase, which is a little bit scary, a little bit intimidating. Roosevelt's language was a magnitude more frightening than anything any politician from the Democratic or Republican parties would say today. It was rougher times.
Now that brings us to a third attorney, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, of course, didn't go to law school. He read law in a law firm. Didn't go to Harvard. He went to Amherst. But you're now working with Calvin Coolidge. Now, I can understand you're working on a book about Roosevelt and writing a book about Roosevelt. He's considered the greatest president of the 20th century. But why Coolidge? Coolidge is thought of as the forgotten president.
Well, stories are like stocks. You look for something that's misvalued. And Roosevelt, unfortunately, although he was a good leader in the war, it has been overvalued for his economic performance. It was a terrible performance. Roosevelt flunked economically. Coolidge is the opposite. He's kind of viewed as mediocre, even trashed, mocked. You see him mocked in the language, for example, of the advisors to President Kennedy later. His place in history is as a low loser who misestimated many things. But I found in my research for the preparation of this book, and it's just in the middle of it this year, that Coolidge was great. So it's a misvaluation in the other direction, and he's a wonderful story of great utility to us in the current period as well.
Well, is it that you were a fan of the period of the Roaring '20s? You don't seem to be the type who drinks champagne from a slipper.
Well, one of the misconceptions we've had is that champagne and slippers were what the 20s were about. And the 20s were about real productivity gains, too. That was the decade in which the country electrified and got automobiles. We changed the way we were. We changed into the person we are now in that decade. So that side of the 20s, and in the Coolidge book, I take a big look at business, has been neglected for what we say the Gatsby part, the Mia Farrow part, the pretty pictures part. Yes, indeed, the stock market, by right and left, I should add, this is not an ideological question. The stock market did go too high, maybe, at the end of the 20s, but that does not undermine the genuine productive growth that we had in the decade. It's a fabulous decade.
Well, let's look at Coolidge's political philosophy. He tried to sum it up in this statement. He said, "Do the day's work. If it be to protect the rights of the weak, whoever objects, do it. If it be to help a powerful corporation better to serve the people, whatever the opposition, do that. Expect to be called a stand-patter, and don't be a stand-patter. Expect to be called a demagogue, but don't be a demagogue. Don't hesitate to be as revolutionary as science. Don't hesitate to be as reactionary as the multiplication table. Don't expect to build up the weak by pulling down the strong. Don't hurry to legislate. Give administration a chance to catch up with legislation. A marvelous statement. Do you share that political philosophy? For president?
Enough to spend 5 years with Calvin, right? I've spent some years with Calvin Coolidge already. Enough to spend a long time with Calvin Coolidge, especially this last line is so unusual. Give administration some time to catch up with statute, with legislation. What he's saying is change we don't believe in. We don't believe in change. We believe in continuity in addition. You know, continuity is a big important thing for us. That's quite contrary to our current culture, where the parties compete to be the bigger changer, the grander changer.
Change you can believe in was Obama's slogan.
Republican change, Democrat, blah, blah, blah. So there we go. What I like very much about Coolidge at the beginning of your sentence was the word do. This is such a paradox. Coolidge believed in restraining government. And we hear that a lot. We hear it from the Tea Party. We hear it from Democrats, too. Remember President Clinton said big government is over. Okay, but usually we don't associate politicians with that. We say outsiders have to come, and we've had successive waves in the United States, whether it was Jimmy Carter or President Obama, someone from the states coming in, not a professional Washingtonian, really, even if they've done some time, as President Obama did in Washington.
Very little time in Washington in his case.
A little time.
As compared with Coolidge, had been vice president. He'd held a number of offices. He was governor of Massachusetts and a number of other public offices. And of course, he became president in 1923 when Warren G. Harding, who had a scandal-riddled administration, died suddenly. And then he was elected in his own right the next year. And he was a very popular president, despite this legacy of scandal that he inherited. What accounted for his popularity?
Well, what I was going to say was this odd combination that he was a big continuity person or a change person, and that he opposed corruption, but he was a professional politician. Sometimes a professional politician can do the work better than a newcomer because he's just farther along on the learning curve, as we say nowadays. Coolidge used all his experience, and he was president of the Senate, as vice president. He presided in his state, Massachusetts, then a more important state, underneath the governor, as a lawmaker in his town of Northampton, Massachusetts. He had considerable legislative experience, and he used that to make government smaller. The headline on Coolidge for this book and for all of us is that when Coolidge left government in 1929, the federal government was smaller than when he came in. So what an unusual man, a government expert who makes government smaller. Yes, he did, as you say, his president Harding died in the summer of 1923. So Coolidge was the accidental president too, or one of our accidental presidents. Then he was elected with a fine majority on his own in 1924. Even though the progressives were doing well, it was thought they might take away from the GOP. In fact, they took away from the Democrats. And he was president for a term plus a year.
Now, Coolidge was a community organizer. We have a man in the White House now as a community organizer. I mean, the parallels are quite extraordinary. He was a progressive. Obama says he's a progressive. Coolidge was a fan of women's suffrage, minority rights, universal health care. And he also, and this is quite interesting, he introduced new forms of communication. He was the first radio president, just as Obama is perhaps the first Facebook president, the first internet president. Do you find these parallels quite striking?
I certainly do, and these are all contrary to the cliche of Coolidge. He's supposed to be not talkative, and yet he went on the radio. If you go on
Silent
YouTube,
cow.
You can see him reading about the tax rate on YouTube, and he's supposed to be not progressive, for sure, silent cow. He had a big progressive element. The GOP was the progressive party historically. I think on balance what he did was more markets-oriented than progressive as actual president. But if you look at the record of the state of Massachusetts where he was, you'll see some of these things. If we say, what is President Obama's home constituency where he began to organize in Chicago? You imagine Hyde Park, the South Side, civic issues, maybe race relations are a big issue on the south side of Chicago, growth, finding jobs. Where did Coolidge learn how to organize? He learned in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Very rural, sort of dairy
State of his
area.
birth.
State of his birth, town of his birth, where his father was a selectman, also went to the state legislature in Montpelier. And Coolidge grew up at those meetings. And what was the topic of the meeting? How much the school tax is. Can we afford a school teacher in this little bitty town? How do we figure out how to afford a school teacher? And I've been following Father Coolidge, Coolidge's father, and very late into the 20th century.
Father swore him in as president when
That's right.
Harding
His
died.
father was a notary, and he swore him in as president. And that's very nice example of Coolidge's theories of economics, too, because he had the local emphasis on the contract between man, and the notaries will be key in that. The National Notary Association has a beautiful Coolidge book out, Why Coolidge Matters, which I was fortunate to participate in with the Calvin Coolidge Memorial Foundation, where I am on the advisory group. And this book's emphasis is not tax rates, it is Coolidge's civility and respect for property and the contract, and his ability to get along with all kinds of politicians, including those of other parties.
Let's talk about his laissez-faire economic policies. He was famous for the phrase, holding back and shutting out. That was his economic approach. It almost resonates with Deng Xiaoping saying, bide and hide. For China. But really, what did he mean by holding back and shutting out? What was his economic approach?
Well, as a lawmaker, as a someone who would preside over the creation of statute, he said, my job is to have less law and less controls on the market because the private sector is more important. So he wrote to his father, it's better to veto a bad law than to sign a good one. Very minimalist. I call him the great refrainer. Everybody calls to mind a sport, even if the sport didn't exist when they did. And if Coolidge were a sport, he'd be a windsurfing. He'd be a windsurfer because you look at it, it looks easy, holding back, staying up. But when you've actually done it, windsurfing, you know it's quite difficult for him
or
to.
Or he could blow over and wind up in the drink.
You could blow over, right? He held back, and that took all his effort. And those who castigated him as lazy, and he was much castigated, or silent, or do nothing, didn't understand that sometimes doing nothing takes more energy than doing something.
Now, he was a fiscal hawk. He balanced the budget. He lowered taxes. I mean, these are all issues that legislators, policymakers are talking about today.
Well, this 25% top rate, he did that with his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, and the rate was already coming down prior to Coolidge, but they got it down to that very likable level of 25. And what's remarkable to me, we're looking at that in the archives now, was this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't, even with Republicans in power, it wasn't easy to get tax cuts. They worked on it. They campaigned. They gave speeches. Mellon, they had several laws in succession till they got there. Mellon wrote a book called Taxation, the People's Business, to explain to the common man why taxes must come down. So it was a sustained campaign. You just can't add taxes in for fun into legislation. You have to convince people, and they saw a moral case.
Well,
as well.
he was a man who relished fun, even though he's thought of as having a very laid-back, stiff image. I mean, he was photographed in Indian headdress. He threw out the first ball at baseball games of the Washington Senators, the opening game. And in a sense, he was quite a character. Yet, when he died and Dorothy Parker was told of his death, she said, how do they know? And
how did they know, she said.
How did they know?
So have you ever noticed something, Jim, when people are truly nasty, and it takes a lot to be that nasty at the moment of the bad news.
Well, if she weren't nasty, she wouldn't be Dorothy Parker.
Well, even to that extent, it's because their case is weak. When they start going and you also see that with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of T.R. Oh, he looks like he's been weaned on a pickle. Well, he did look that way, but there was much more to him, and it was because they dared not take on the substance of what he did, which was hard to attack, hard to assail. The growth was very strong in the 3s, maybe a little bit better. Sometimes there's deflation in the 20s, so growth is higher than it looks on paper. Wow, we wish we could have that. We wish we could have the unemployment rate they had when they had a high.
Well, when he left office, it was about 3.5%.
It was about 3.5%, and it wasn't fake. Not only that, but you want to recall that in the early 20s, the unemployment rate in the cities went up to 19 for a moment or two during the downturn of the early 20s, and yet they got it down to 5 or 3. And it's that celerity, that speed that we so long for today, because now unemployment seems to stick forever at these high levels. How did they get it down? By making it clear to business that America was open for business. It's not just sort of themes. They actually believed that the business of America is business.
Yes, you spoke of his civility, but he was, which certainly resonates with something that's going on today, but he also was noted for being laconic, for a certain brevity of expression. I mean, there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, of the woman who was supposed to sit next to him at a dinner party, and she had a wager with her husband. Her husband wagered that Coolidge would not say more than 2 words. And when she told Coolidge of this, Coolidge said, "You lose." And now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's consistent with the image we have of Silent Cal. Now, do you accept that?
No, I think he's a silenced Cal, silenced by history and by revisionist posts, but no, he spoke quite a bit. He may well have said that. I think he did say that. But you want to take into account being president is an exhausting job. And if you are shaking 1,000 hands in a morning, which they did quite routinely, there are times when you feel as though you better shut up. And Coolidge had a very good idea. He said, when you don't talk, people quickly run out of words to say to you, and they can't ask you for something. And if he believed in less government, he didn't want to give something to every visitor, so he held back. It was also of course, his New England style.
Yes. Now, of course, Coolidge was somewhat paradoxical, a mixed bag in ways. Roosevelt was as well, but there was the infamous Immigration Act of 1924, which established quotas from countries, and which was bitterly opposed by Congressman Seller, and the whole thing wasn't set right until the 1950s. There was his attitude toward the Ku Klux Klan. 1924 must have been a fascinating election, with the Democrats refusing to take a stand against the Klan because Southerners were so powerful in the Democratic Party, and Coolidge refused to take a stand against them either.
Well, I'm not so sure that's correct. In the records that we've undug, and my fellow researcher, Nikolai Krylov, has done that, you can find a letter from Coolidge saying he does not, from his office, saying the president doesn't approve of the Ku Klux Klan.
Didn't say that publicly in the course of the campaign.
Nobody was loud about and that he believed in the laws of the states. And of course, lynchings are illegal, even in states. They were not. The law was not enforced in that period. So I won't say Coolidge. If you look also at the rate of violence in the South, it goes down in Coolidge's time. Would that he had stopped it more forcefully? Yes. Immigration, yeah, he had a more restrictionist view, and I don't personally share that view. Immigration is a great driver of happiness and growth in the United States, but we're trying to go back and understand him, not judge him. And what he saw at that time was that, and it's an interesting concept, to grow best and stay happiest, the United States need to be sure of who it was. And he had a concept of that. It was the United States of the contract and growth and piety. So they all believed that immigration should be less, and also that North Europeans should come here. I don't condone that, but I certainly want to try and lay it out in my new book about Coolidge.
In 1928, he issued the very brief statement, "I do not choose to run for re-election," even though his re-election was a virtual certainty. Why didn't he want to run?
Well, this is the great example of Coolidge in action, demonstrating his philosophy by making a big sacrifice. It's very hard not to run for president again if you're a big politician and all your advisors say you're a shoo-in. This was 1928. The GOP was going to win, clearly. He didn't particularly like the one who would replace him, Herbert Hoover, his Commerce Secretary, and yet he chose not to run. And historically, biographers have emphasized psychology there. Coolidge was tired. His son had died while he was in office. That was a great blow. His father had died. I don't emphasize psychology, though he was tired. Coolidge was heroic. He said, basically, the longer you stay in Washington, and you can see this in his autobiography, which I gave to freshman lawmakers recently in a speech I gave there.
The result is being forgotten.
Yeah,
So,
that you become more corrupt the longer you stay in Washington.
Amity Shlaes, I'm afraid we have to wrap up. This has been absolutely marvelous, but I have a question for you. If Coolidge isn't the forgotten president, what should he be remembered for?
Taxes and growth.
I mean, low taxes.
Low taxes. Remember,
and high growth.
Would that we had a decade like Coolidge's. Let's read about him and find out how he did it.
Amity Shlaes, thank you so much for coming by. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more about the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night, all the best, and please visit our website, www.digitalage.org.